Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ESU Happy Hour. Today's presentation is Lusitania, a story of loss, deception, and conspiracy from World War I with James Stebbings. My name is Elizabeth Bigelow, and I am the manager of branch services at the English-speaking Union of the United States. I'd like to give a big thank you to the Syracuse branch, who is sponsoring today's Happy Hour. Ideas for our Happy Hour lectures come from you, our ESU members and viewers. At the end of this program, you will receive a survey where you can share your feedback on tonight's lecture, as well as any ideas you might have for upcoming Happy Hour lectures. Before we get into the program, I would like to note a few things about today's presentation. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the lecture. If you have a question, you can use the dedicated Q&A and chat modules that are at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Questions will be answered in the order they're received. I'm happy to say that tonight we have about 250 people registered for this event. I would also like to give a shout out to the branches that have the most registered members. Those branches are the Central Florida, Atlanta, and Syracuse branches. And to start us off today, I would like to introduce Carl Bourning, who is completing his third year as president of the Syracuse branch. He's going to talk a little bit about his branch, and then he's also going to introduce tonight's speaker. So, Carl, if you could go ahead and get us started.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Really appreciate the introduction and the kind words about Syracuse. I think most of you, when you think of the branches of the English-speaking Union, you think of really large places like Boston, New York, New Orleans, to name just a few. But there are some smaller branches like Syracuse, which I guess we'd call medium-sized. We've been around for 74 years, which I think is interesting. We have typically from 70 to 90 active members in any given year. We have multi-phases to our programs, but I'll mention just two. Our general program for the membership is a monthly lecture series and luncheon, and that runs from September through May. Our speakers cover a really widely diverse area of topics chosen by our program committee. For example, this past year, we had such diverse things as a lecture on adult literacy, a lecture by an entrepreneur who had set up a local market to encourage new entrepreneurs within that market, a lecture by an explorer of shipwrecks of the St. Lawrence, and an actress who performed worldwide in musical theater and gave us a list of her experiences. So that's part of what we do. The other thing that's a major thing for us is our local Shakespeare competition. We have anywhere from 15 to 25 high schools competing each year in that. And the winners from each high school compete at Syracuse stage. And there a regional winner is chosen and goes to compete in the national in New York City. I might note this year we did get our regional winner did become a finalist, which is good news. Now getting on to why you're here. Many of you will recall Jim Stebbings from his presentation of the topsy-turvy world of Gilbert and Sullivan, their world, their lives, and their music, which he presented at a happy hour this past year. Today's presentation is about that ill-fated ship, the Lusitania, and I know that Jim will make the connection between this topic and his usual passion, the world of theatrical entertainment. My wife Alice and I first met James Stebbings less than a week ago when he visited Syracuse, which shows not only can you meet with old friends if you're a member of ESU, but also you can meet very interesting people and gain new friends through the English-speaking Union. It was our pleasure to show Jim some of the area sites in the brief time we had with him. And getting to know Jim, we discussed theater, the COVID pandemic, of course, our mutual travel interests and experiences, and inevitably some minor differences surface between American and British culture. For example, the Brits seem to think that 100 miles is a long distance. We Americans, on the other hand, seem to think that 100 years is a long time. Jim gave our group an outstanding lecture, and you are in for a rare treat today. Jim's command of facts is quite remarkable. How he does it with very few notes is amazing to me. His enthusiasm for his subject rings out throughout his presentation. So, as an obligation of an introducer, of just a few notes on Jim's background. After a short career in the British Army, Jim trained as an accountant and financial administrator and spent 26 years in a senior position working in a London office of an American-based international energy company. During this time, he traveled extensively, visiting more than 30 countries, enjoying many visits to the US, and he finished his professional career working in the Netherlands and in Spain. But after retirement, that's when he had time to work on his enthusiasm for theater, and especially musical theater, in the world of drama and theatrical entertainment, participating whenever he has had the opportunity. After his retirement, he moved to Norfolk in the east of England, where he has been able to give his time to the subject he loves. This includes organizing music festivals, managing and representing some professional performers, creating and performing historical reenactments for a local museum, and performing with a pianist friend in a musical duo. Of late, I'm just trying to get my notes apart. In recent years, Jim has specialized in presenting talks on songwriters associated with the Great American Songbook and with the lives and works of Gilbert and Sullivan, who created the bridge between grand opera and the great musicals of the 20th century. I am delighted and privileged to now introduce our evening's happy hour speaker, James Stebbings.
So am I now live with you all? So I'm going to assume I am and say what a great pleasure it is to be with you all this evening. It's especially nice to be reunited with a number of people I met in State College, Boston, Cleveland, and Syracuse last week. And so, in the usual fashion, I'm going to toast the special relationship between our nations and the special relationship I have developed with people there in the States through the English-speaking Union. And this is the Peter Pan cocktail, which comes from my Savoy cocktail book. And I will leave you to spot the connection between the Peter Pan cocktail and my presentation as I continue. So cheers to everyone. So I think the next thing I need to do is to share my screen with you, which always is a moment of anxiety, but we hope it's going to work smoothly. I now call up my presentation. Make a little adjustment to the screen, and hopefully you are seeing, just a moment. I think you're seeing a stormy scene with my name on it. And so we will proceed, because our story today is a story of war, a story from the First World War, the Great War, the war that was to end all wars. I'm just going to make an adjustment to my screen so that I can, got a whole load of pictures here that I don't really need. So, and a war which Britain entered on the 4th of August 1914 after German troops had invaded Belgium. And when I think of the horrors of that war, the image that frequently comes to my mind is that of life in the trenches in Belgium and in France. However, it was a war fought in the air and on the water. And our story today is a story about war at sea, a tragedy of loss, deception, and conspiracy. Story of the loss of the Royal Mail ship Lusitania. I'm just going to make another little adjustment to what you see, if I may. Lucy, as she was fondly known, was the pride of the Cunard cross-Atlantic fleet. She was first of 3 great 4-funnel liners built for Cunard, the others being the Mauretania and the Aquitania. The names of all these 3 ships was derived from the Roman names of regions in Europe of historic maritime significance. Lusitania being a region of northwest Portugal, shown with the blue arrow on my slide, just south of the river Douro. The British Admiralty had lent Cunard £2.6 million towards the building of these ships, which were referred to as the upcoming Ocean Greyhounds, designed to outstrip the speed of the great German liners, previously the fastest on the transatlantic route. The extra speed coming from the Parsons turbine engines, which had been developed in Britain. In return, the Admiralty required certain features to be incorporated into the design so that, if necessary, she could be converted in what was called a merchant cruiser. This included having gun mountings on the superstructure, though not guns themselves. Give me a second, I just need to, still want to make a little adjustment. Getting too much picture on the side of people, and I'm trying to see if I can just move that aside a bit. I don't seem to be able to. Oh, never mind. So our Lusitania was not the first to be given the name Lusitania. There was a French frigate in the first part of the 19th century with the same name. And then there came the steamship Lusitania, owned by the Orient Steam Navigation Company much later in the century, which was wrecked off Nova Scotia in 1901. She's shown in the picture here. Our old friend, who I have to bring in, of course, William Schwenk Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan fame, had sailed on the this particular Lusitania the decade before. And when studying the lives of Gilbert and Sullivan, and I read that Gilbert had traveled to Egypt in the Lusitania, I was somewhat startled and puzzled until I found it was the previous vessel lost in 1901 that he had traveled in. And so that name, the Lusitania, we should call it now just Lucy, Lusitania, is our subject today, which was the one launched in 1906. At 787 feet long, our subject was the largest ship of her kind afloat, though Titanic, which came later in 1911, and the Aquitania that came later were a little longer. For comparison, Queen Mary II, the Cunard cross-Atlantic liner now in service, is 1,131 feet. compared with our Lusitania's 787 feet. The 4 propellers were driven by steam from boilers, which required 25 boilers, which required 1,000 tons per day. She was very hungry, but at a speed of nearly 26 knots or nearly 30 miles an hour, she was the fastest on the Atlantic run. One factor that made her popular with British and Americans. One night less at sea. She had the modern safety features required by the Admiralty, with a total of 48 lifeboats, enough for all the passengers and the crew. On her second voyage, Lusitania claimed the coveted blue ribbon for a voyage of just under 5 days, about several hours quicker than her competitors. It was her sister ship that came later, Mauretania, that took the blue ribbon from Lucy when she crossed in about 19 hours quicker, a record she kept for 20 years. Incidentally, the blue ribbon is still held today by the SS United States, when in 1952 she crossed in just 3.5 days. When I was growing up and living on the south coast of England, I would be sitting on the perhaps the beach, my local beach, and sometimes, if I was lucky, I would see the SS United States pass along the water, an area of water off the south coast of England near the naval port of Portsmouth called Spithead, and it would be on its way to the commercial port of Southampton. Now, Lusitania was popular with Americans for its speed, style, and luxury on board, and it frequently welcomed celebrities and entertainers such as Irving Berlin, the most popular songwriter of the age, whose music was frequently played by the onboard orchestra in first class. He made his first crossing in 1910 on Lusitania to promote his music, especially his great international hit, Alexander's Ragtime Band. And it was my study of Berlin that caused me to become interested in Lusitania, and which turned out to be such a great story as I was reading it, looking for clues about when Berlin had been on board. And I thought, this is such a wonderful story. This needs to be told. And in any case, with my other talks on theatrical music, I probably felt I should have something in my repertoire that was non-musical. Now, on board, the first class accommodation was particularly impressive, being light and bright and using a great deal of plaster formed in the Louis XVI style. Unlike Mauretania, which came next, because she was fitted out largely in dark wood paneling in an Edwardian style. Our story begins on the 1st of May, 1915, as Lusitania prepares to make the eastward voyage from Newark to Liverpool on what was to be her 202nd Atlantic crossing. At the time, America was not in the war and had announced its neutrality. In fact, the US did not enter until 1917. At the time, in the war in Europe, Britain had set up a shipping blockade of German ports, and Germany retaliated by sending its new weapon of war, the U-boat or submarine, to blockade seaports around Britain and Ireland. And Germany had also started gas attacks in the trenches of Belgium, particularly in the area around Ypres. Such use of gas was against the Liebel Convention, but war was already getting dirty. Germany had given notice that ships in the Atlantic flying the British flag were liable to be attacked, and this notice was posted by the German embassy in the New York press, as you can see with the blue arrow here, just under Cunard's own announcement of its sailing. And let's see what it says. Travelers are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and Great Britain, and that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles. In accordance with the former notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or of any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and the travellers sailing in the war zone or ships of Great Britain do so at their own risk. And as you see, this was posted right underneath the notice of the departure. Formerly, under the rules at sea, merchant ships were not to be attacked unless they were found to be carrying arms. If suspected of being armed or carrying arms, they should be stopped and searched. And if arms were found, the civilians or crew were to be removed, and then the ship was a legitimate target. But the German announcement warns of attack merely if a ship is flying the British flag. At one time, Lucy had sailed with a US flag, but the US objected to this, and now it seemed it normally sailed with no flag at all. However, those preparing to sail in Lusitania on this crossing to Liverpool considered an attack unlikely because there were many neutral Americans aboard. In any case, with a speed of 26 knots, approximately twice the speed of a submerged submarine, it was felt unlikely that she could be caught. And other measures were normally taken. The ships were advised to zigzag when they were in the danger zone, and normally it was expected that a UK naval escort would be provided as she appeared in the zone. She sailed under the command of experienced Cunard captain William Thomas Turner, a well-trusted, experienced Cunard employee, a native of Liverpool, and known as Bowler Bill, because out of uniform he wore a bowler hat. And so, despite the warning, but with only about 58% passenger capacity on board, and consequently a reduced, and it seems inexperienced crew, she prepared to leave for her 10:30 a.m. departure from New York. The crew included the band of 5 musicians. She actually left 1.5 hours late because of the transfer of 41 passengers from another liner which did not sail and which had been requisitioned by the British Admiralty. As usual, a crowd lined the harbour wall to witness her departure. It was always a magnificent sight. Lucy carried an extensive mixed cargo, and the manifest list includes a total of 2,400 empty cartridge cases and fuses for explosive shells. This is shown here, ringed in red on the manifest. According to the Admiralty, this did not contravene the regulations. There were 3 classes of passengers on board, and we shall follow a few from each. Most notable in first class was American Alfred Vanderbilt of the enormously rich and influential Vanderbilt family, whose wealth included ownership of the New York Vanderbilt Hotel, shown here, but they had made their money initially from shipping and other ventures. Vanderbilt was a frequent visitor and admirer of the English way of life, with many English friends, especially around the Surrey countryside. That's an area south of London. Also in first class was American Charles Frohman, theatrical impresario and producer of 700 productions in London and New York. And in London, he first produced J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan to great acclaim. He leased London's Duke of York Theatre, and he visited at least annually. He was seen off in New York by his life partner and companion, Charles Dillingham, also a theatrical producer. Not on board, but meant to be travelling with Frohman, was his friend, Jerome Kern, famous songwriter of such songs at the time as "The Folks Who Live on the Hill" and "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes." It's widely claimed and recorded by Kern himself that he missed the ship because he overslept, having played cards the night before. Personally, I sometimes doubt the veracity of this, especially since the ship left late and he lived in Manhattan. I sometimes wonder whether perhaps he was concerned about the German statement, but was not prepared to admit it. That's just my little hunch. And who could blame him if that was true? First-class passengers enjoyed plush accommodation and entertainment from the onboard orchestra, and they enjoyed fine food. In second class, we meet Avis Dolphin, age 13, traveling with two nurses from Ontario, where her widowed mother ran a nursing home. She was being sent for an English education. She suffered badly from seasickness as the ship got underway. Also in second class was academic Dr. Ian Holborn, Scottish father of three and professor and lecturer of art and archaeology at Oxford and in the USA. He was also a writer and laird of the Scottish island of Fowler. As an experienced cross-Atlantic voyager, he befriended Avis and her nurses and told Avis stories to help her forget her sickness. He also helped her become familiar with the ship and in the use of the life jacket and the passageways up to the lifeboats, as he did other passengers in that class. There had been no lifeboat drill, and neither had passengers been assigned to any one lifeboat. However, on the third day, Holborn received a letter from the captain demanding that he refrain from doing this because he was spreading unnecessary anxiety. As the ship got properly underway, Holborn thought she was traveling at a reduced speed from what he'd experienced before. In third class, we meet the Hook family, who'd emigrated from England to Canada a few years before, only for wife and mother to die young. And in their sorrow, 18 months later, they were going back home. In their possession were their documents for onward travel from Liverpool to London. Daughter Elsie was traveling as a child, though actually she was over age, and her father had told her to make herself look small as they boarded. George Hook was an athletic man, and he'd won the first-class passenger running race on the second day. The first 5 days of the crossing were calm and uneventful, if somewhat slow. It seemed to Holborn that one boiler appeared to be out of action. Around 1 p.m. on the 6th day, the 7th of May, Lucy was approaching Southern Island, which came into view as she emerged into the sun out of fog. Sight of land was a cause for excitement. One more night, and they would be in Liverpool, arriving on the high tide the next morning. Approaching Ireland, Captain Turner posted a lookout and ordered portholes and watertight doors to be closed, knowing he was approaching the area patrolled by U-boats. He then decided to take a bearing from the Kinsale Lighthouse. Having come out of that fog, he was a little unsure where he was, and so he took a bearing from the Kinsale Lighthouse, which required him to take a straight course for a few minutes, whilst he looked out for the expected naval escort. It did not appear. Lucy was around 12 miles from the Irish coast, and she was not zigzagging, it seemed. It's now around 1 p.m. on the 7th of May, already 6 days into the voyage, and all classes were having their lunch. Vanderbilt and Frohman were throwing a last day party. The orchestra playing, amongst other things, Berlin's song, "I Love a Piano." Others from all classes went up on deck to take a view of the old Kinsale Head lighthouse that Captain Turner was using for his bearing. Around this time, German U-boat U-20 was patrolling the area just off the Irish coast, a well-used approach for liners, cross-Atlantic liners. His submarine was manned with 4 officers and 31 men. She was patrolling the blockaded area, marked in the dark blue here, under this command of this young captain, who, having the previous day sunk British steamer Candidate, which had been carrying groceries and hardware to the West Indies, was looking for his next potential target. He was cruising at periscope depth. Just after 2 p.m., a large 4-funnel ship was spied sailing in a straight line further offshore and not zigzagging. And although the submarine had an identification expert on board, trained to recognize regular ships, Schweiger claims that they did not identify the ship as Lusitania. I'm always tempted to say, a likely story. How many 4-funneled liners would be sailing at any one time? Schweiger was surprised, but no doubt delighted to see that the ship continued to sail in a straight line and in a perfect broadside position. And so at 2 p.m., he ordered the firing of a torpedo aimed at Lucy's starboard side. The band were now playing the Blue Danube. Those lining the ship on the starboard side suddenly noticed a streak of foam in the water. Shouts went up, and within a few seconds, the torpedo found its target between funnels 2 and 3 on the starboard side. It was later described by one survivor as a thud, followed by an explosion, which created a large hole under the waterline, and Lusitania immediately began to take on water. Some claim there was a second torpedo, but this was later to be disputed. Most passengers realized what had happened, and screams and cries rang out amongst the chaos as people stared in disbelief or ran in all directions. Some had life jackets at hand. Some did not seem to know how to put them on, some fatally putting them on upside down. Some grabbed buoys and others made for the lifeboats. Vanderbilt and Frohman came up on deck, Frohman being heard to say, "I never thought they would do it, and this is going to be a close thing." Avis and the 2 nurses were finishing their desserts when Ian Holborn saw to it that they had their life jackets, and he led them up on deck. Avis protesting she was missing her dessert. The Hook family took themselves on deck, but could not get near the lifeboats. They prayed together and prayed with others. They witnessed scenes of panic and chaos as there was a third explosion, probably from a boiler, and water penetrated all the lower decks while people tried to escape. Vanderbilt and Frohman stood helplessly on deck as the ship began to keel over. They allowed others to use the lifeboats, and Vanderbilt even gave his life jacket to a young woman holding a baby without one. Some members of the crew, together with passengers from the lower decks, had tried to use the lift, but the power had failed, and many were trapped as she started to list to starboard within just a couple of minutes. The list to starboard meant that the crew were not able to launch the portside lifeboats, and though the crew tried to launch the starboard lifeboats, it seemed they were poorly trained and poorly managed, and people were tipped out as they were lowered. Ian Holborn had got Avis and the 2 nurses into a lifeboat, but watched in horror as they were all tipped out. Holborn simply jumped, but became entangled in some ropes, though eventually getting himself free. He was in the water for some time, holding another man without a life jacket, only to find when he was hauled into a rescue ship himself, he was now holding a corpse. George Hook and his son and daughter simply jumped into the water, becoming separated as they did so. At 2:20, Radio Officer Robert Leith, who had bravely stayed at his post, sent out his last message. Come at once, big list. Come at once, big list. There might have been even further explosions, after which Lucy was sinking rapidly, with the bow going under first and water continuing to cover all or part of all decks. Around the ship were scenes of horror, with people in the water or in boats if they were lucky. People clung to whatever they could find. One survivor described it as a carpet of bodies and floating objects, with just 6 of the 48 available lifeboats being launched. It was hell on water. All around, people screaming, shouting, crying, or praying. However, as the minutes passed, the noise gave way to a deathly silence. And at 2:41, she was gone. Stern with the name Lusitania and the 4 propellers, the last to disappear under the water. It had taken Lucy just 20 minutes to sink. It had taken Titanic more than 3 hours to sink. First to arrive on the scene was the fishing smack, the Wanderer, out of Peel, Isle of Man nearby, which had been mackerel fishing with its crew of 7, and they had seen disturbance on the water. In total, she was to rescue 160 survivors, including Ian Holborn, and he and others were later transferred to bigger ships to be delivered in Queenstown on the Irish coast, the first to arrive at 6 p.m. Another witness said that the British ship Indian Empire was first on the scene, but this is unclear. All the rescue ships made for Queenstown on the Irish coast. Also on the scene was the government tug Stormcock, rescuing survivors from the water and transferring others onto other ships. The last to arrive in Queenstown was HMS Bluebell at 11 p.m, 10 hours after the incident. She arrived with 47 survivors, including Captain Turner, who'd jumped towards the end. He thought he was the last to leave. In fact, there were others still on board, but as far as he knew, he'd stayed with his ship and clung to a floating chair. The ship also contained 10 dead. Queenstown became a bustle of activity and despair. So survivors were made comfortable in hotels and homes or in the hospital, many with injuries and from the effects of cold, many distressed, looking for relatives or friends. An emergency morgue was set up, and in the morning, groups of survivors could be seen around Queenstown in borrowed clothing. Many were still seeking relatives and friends, and the fortunate ones found them in hotels, homes, or in the hospital. Sadly, others found the relatives or friends in the morgue. Avis found Ian Holborn in the hospital, suffering from the effects of being in the water for so long. She stayed with him for long periods and comforted him. Sadly, there were no sign of the 2 nurses who travelled with her. The next morning, May the 8th, the newspapers in Britain and in the USA told the story. As the news became known, there were anti-German demonstrations and riots in Liverpool and across the country. Germany, however, was defiant, claiming they were in their right to attack because there were arms on board. Among the missing were Vanderbilt and Frohman, shown here in the newspaper with those blue arrows. The body of Vanderbilt was never recovered. He had died a hero, however, as it was related by some survivors that he had indeed given his life jacket to a woman and child, even though it was only revealed later that he was a non-swimmer. Frohman had not survived either, but his body was washed up some days later. His injuries indicated that he had been hit by a heavy object. He was returned to New York with other corpses and survivors, where he was embalmed and where he lay in his synagogue before his burial. Services were also held for him at St. Paul's Cathedral and St. Martin's in the Field in London. He was that well known. And if you remember, our friend Kern had missed the sailing, but went on to write the groundbreaking musical Showboat 10 years later. And the Hook family, although they were all separated at the outset, they all survived, though Sam Frank was only found by his father and sister 2 days later in hospital, suffering from a broken leg, shown here in the center of this piece. Thinking that he was now an orphan, somebody else had offered to adopt Frank, though it's obviously proved unnecessary. Returning to England later, young Frank went on to study engineering at Manchester before the entire family of 3 went on to emigrate to Australia. Frank eventually went on to form an engineering company and lived to the age of 94. His company later changed its name and became Hook Plastics, which still exists in Australia to this day. A mass funeral took place on May the 10th, when 169 of the 289 bodies recovered were buried, many unidentified, including mothers and babies. The funeral procession was led by the Royal Irish Constabulary and the Band of the Irish Guards, who played Chopin's Funeral March. The mourners sang Abide With Me at the graveside, and 20 buglers played the last post. These were, after all, innocent victims of war. Of the 1,960 people on board, 767 survived, but 1,193 poor souls were lost, fairly evenly across the 3 classes, a survival rate of around 60%. Of the 159 Americans on board, 124 perished. Of the 124 children on board, 94 perished. Of the band of 3, 3 survived. The Titanic's loss was greater at 1,517. However, the greatest loss at sea occurred during World War II, when an estimated 9,400 people died on the German ship Wilhelm Goldstoff when she was torpedoed by the Russians in the Baltic after having evacuated Germans from the Baltic states to escape the advancing Russian army. A memorial to Vanderbilt stands along one of our major routes in England, the A24 near Dorking in Surrey, placed by his English friends. A memorial to Frohman in the form of a fountain is in a park in the town of Marlow, erected by friends and made by Leonard Stanford Merrifield, who designed many of our World War I memorials in towns and cities around this country. Seems that Frohman apparently loved the Thames River, and Marlow sits on the River Thames. And Why a Naked Lady is said to be a nymph portraying the actresses that started their careers through his productions, and is perhaps a reference to his most famous production of Peter Pan. Avis Dolphin's survival was telegrammed to her mother, the telegram saying, "Avis saved." Later, a book was written based on her experience, and here she is, standing with her family in later life. She and Ian Holborn became lifelong friends, and she was to meet what was to become her journalist husband, Thomas Foley, when visiting in Holborn in Scotland a few years later. She died at the age of 94. Ian Holborn recovered, and he accompanied Avis to the home of her grandparents. He went on to have a full and successful life, dying in 1935, and you can read an account of Holborn's life on the internet. We should perhaps mention this remarkable man, George Beecham, a stoker who survived both the Titanic and the Lusitania sinkings, and he continued to work at sea, but apparently only on the small coastal boats in sight of land, and he later became a docker in Southampton. There are many other human stories attached to this tragedy worth your attention, and I particularly like this one regarding Gerda Nielsen and John Walsh. Gerda, 29, was a dressmaker in New York and was traveling to see her sister in England. And whilst eating in the company of the Hook family in first class on the first night, she met engineer John Walsh. They fell immediately in love during the crossing, and they survived together and married in Manchester within a week of the rescue. This is a picture at their wedding. However, even this has a somewhat sad ending, since she suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder and spent a large part of her latter life in a mental home, dying in 1961, 20 years after the death of her husband. I should also mention George A. Kessler, an American champagne importer, who in 1905 had famously had a party at the Savoy Hotel with the theme of Gilbert and Sullivan's The Gondoliers, at which the hotel had flooded an open forecourt into a scene of Venice, complete with gondolas and swans and even an elephant from London Zoo. What that's got to do with Venice, I don't know. However, he was known to have an extravagant lifestyle, and he survived in a lifeboat whilst others around him died, and he vowed if he was saved, he would do more good in the world. And together with death author and activist Helen Keller, they formed the Helen Keller Foundation for the Blind, for research and education, and the charity that still exists today. And I believe Kessler Champagne still exists also. Germany continued to justify its actions, though many anti-German riots continued around the UK and in America. In what many people believe to be in bad taste, Germany issued a commemorative medal, though getting the date wrong on the medal. You can just about see where the blue arrow is. It says on the 5th of May and should have said the 7th of May. The loss of Lusitania offered Britain and indeed the USA new opportunities for recruitment and anti-German propaganda, as seen on this poster. By 1917, Germany was attacking American mercantile ships too, on the basis that they were supplying Britain. 2 years later, President Wilson announced the entry of USA into the war, the Lusitania still being used as a form of propaganda. This poster depicting children under the water reaching into the hands of the American sailors. Naturally, many Christians come to mind, so let's consider a few. Should she have sailed? Well, personally, it seems to me quite reckless to sail with that warning post directly under the notice of the sailing, but perhaps Cunard had commercial considerations and maybe some of her cargo was urgent, and those aboard had their own reasons for wanting to sail. I still feel it was foolhardy, though they did expect the escort that hadn't shown up. Was the captain negligent? Certainly there are questions here. Why did he sail slowly? Was there a mechanical fault? Or was he ordered to save fuel and money because of the reduced number of passengers? Her speed was one of her great protections, and he did not zigzag as was recommended. He claimed he was never advised to zigzag. And why was there such poor launching of the lifeboats? Why was it so chaotic? Were the Germans entitled to attack? Well, formally not, though the Admiralty had been involved in Lucy's construction, and then she was listed as a RN reserved, Royal Naval Reserve merchant cruiser, and although her deck had been fitted with gun mountings, there was no evidence that guns were mounted at the time. There were neutrals aboard. If they thought she was carrying arms, she should have been stopped and searched. If arms were found, the law required that civilians be removed before the ship was scuttled. On the other hand, they had issued that warning in the New York press. Were the empty cartridge cases arms for this purpose? It was a rumor there were spies on board and that they had indeed found other arms being loaded. Was she singled out? Well, as I said earlier, it seems that the Germans claimed that they did not recognize as Lusitania, which I think is most unlikely. And they knew exactly the sort of time she would be entering the Irish waters. So she was a great target and something they would be very pleased and proud to have achieved. The official inquiry concluded that it was an illegal act of war and that Germany was alone responsible. But the British, but talk of a British elite conspiracy also existed. The suspicion being that Britain allowed this to happen in order to gain the support of the USA and their entry into the war. And the name that continually came up as the architect of the conspiracy, First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. So, was she carrying arms in addition to those items shown in the manifest? Well, the questions still remain. What were those other explosions after the initial strike? Were they from explosives, or, as been put forward as a theory, just from gas from the empty coal bunkers? Soon after the incident, Churchill was removed, and evidence has never been revealed that it was a conspiracy, but the questions persist to this day. One commentator, however, said that rather than a conspiracy, it was negligence because Churchill was busy trying to save his reputation in other war zones, and those working under him were used to him alone taking total personal control and making decisions, and they were afraid to make a decision for an escort without him. At the 4-day official inquiry, what has been referred to as the secret elite initially tried to pin much of the blame on Captain Turner, but when its evidence failed, the inquiry concluded that Germany was entirely to blame for an illegal act. It concluded that the German accusation that she was carrying arms was a baseless invention. However, there are still rumors of a cover-up. She now lies at the bottom of the ocean at around 300 feet, and although attempts have been made to investigate and salvage her, the only salvaging has been 2 of her 4 propellers. The British Admiralty still warns off potential salvagers on the basis of remaining danger. Danger of what? Danger of explosives still on board, one asks. In 1993, the submersible Delta with oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard. Sorry. My computer wants to go to sleep. Let's see if we. Let's hope that doesn't happen. He was looking for evidence of where the torpedo had struck and whether it was an empty coal bunker that caused the initial explosions. Captain Turner went on to command other Cunard ships and was again torpedoed on January 1917 and was later to receive an OBE. He was the last to leave that ship. Sadly, several of the survivors of Lusitania went on to be killed as serving servicemen. Turner retired to his native Liverpool in 1919 at the age of 63 after 41 years of service. He died and was buried in Liverpool. One of the propellers recovered in 1982 remains on the quayside in Liverpool, outside the Maritime Museum, and is frequently the venue for services and pilgrimages. Bizarrely, the other one stands outside a hotel in Dallas, bought by a private collector. Many of the archives pertaining to Lucy and her loss are held at Liverpool University. The last survivor to die is this lady who died in 2011 at the age of 95. She had only been a baby at the time, and she had lost two sisters in the incident. In her later life, she went on to say, "I hope I lived up to being saved." I'm sure she did. In fact, she raised money for a lifeboat that still operates in Wales. This memorial garden stands at Old Kinsale Head in Cork, opened in the ceremony in May 2017, 102 years after the incident. Note the depiction of a wave as part of the memorial containing the names of all those on board. And these memorials stand in the graveyard in Queenstown. This statue memorial stands in Casement Square in Cove, renamed formerly Queenstown, with the inscription, "Peace in God's name." U-20, well, she had sunk 37 ships, but ran aground on the Danish coast in November 1916, still under the command of Schweiger, and the crew destroyed and left her unoperable. Schweiger was killed in action on the 5th of September 1917 when his submarine was sunk by British ship HMS Stonecrop, a secretly armed merchant ship, with the loss of the entire submarine crew. There are many resources available to us for further investigation, including many online. These include the stories of many of those on board. After all, for each victim or survivor, there is a story to be told. And so, this tragic tale of World War I, a war that claimed the lives of 37 million people, including 1,193 on Lusitania. I hope you found it interesting and thought-provoking. I sometimes feel that the story of Lusitania receives much less attention than that of Titanic. But as an act of war, and as perhaps an incident of deception and even conspiracy, I feel it demands our further attention.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so very much, Jim, for that enlightening and thorough lecture about the Lusitania. So I'm now going to open it up a bit for a few minutes for questions. Just as a reminder to everyone, you can ask questions via the Q&A or the chat module that you can see at the bottom of your screen. And I guess I'll just go ahead and start. We did receive a question from a Mary Ellen Mattis, and her question is in regards to the cargo list. She's wondering, she has newspaper accounts of about $50,000 worth of pocket knives made by Walden manufacturers for the British Army. And she's wondering if the ship might have been targeted for its cargo.
I'm not sure I heard that very clearly. Is the question, was she targeted because of her cargo?
Correct. Was it targeted because of what it may have been transporting?
Well, certainly. I think that as we saw, there were what we might call a form of arms or part of what we would loosely call arms. The cartridges and fuses were on board. It was suspected, and maybe it is true because we're still not sure, that there were indeed other arms on board and explosives. There was all kinds of other cargo, but I think in any case, she was a very notable target for the Germans. Lusitania was very famous, and I think in terms of propaganda and what happens in war, people would be glad and proud as the German nation then to have claimed such a notable target. So I think she was certainly singled out, and the story that they didn't recognize her, I don't think it can be believed. And I think that they were lying in wait for her, frankly, and anything else that passed along in that zone. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I believe so. Our next question is from Tom Gettelfinger, and he was wondering if you had any information on room 40 and that the British had cracked the German code and were following U-boats.
Again, that wasn't very clear to me. I'm not sure I recognized anything much of what you said. Could you just repeat that?
I apologize. I apologize. So Tom Gettelfinger is wondering about the involvement of the British cracking the German codes, and if them following the U-boats, or if room 40 had anything to do with it.
Oh, right. Well, I'm going to have to dodge that one, I'm afraid, because I have to say that's out of my area of learning for this talk. And it would be wrong of me to try and answer a question that I'm not qualified to answer. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to duck out on that one.
No worries. All right, and then I have a few more for you. This question is about the passengers and wondering why you think passengers were prepared to ignore the warning and travel at all.
Well, that is something I often wonder about. I think they probably all individually had their own reasons. Maybe some had urgent business. Maybe there's a certain time or date they need to be where they needed to be. But many of them, I think, perhaps thought it was safe because there were neutrals on board, and according to the rules of the war at sea, if there were neutrals, she should not be attacked. Her speed was her greatest defense, and as we have seen, she was traveling only approximately I think it was about an average of 18 knots instead of a 26, but they were relying on the fact that it was felt that a submerged submarine that could only travel at about 15 or 16 knots would not be able to catch her, particularly if she was zigzagging. So they probably thought that it was really unlikely that she would be caught, that she would be attacked, and the attack would be successful. But no doubt they all had their own reasons. But quite frankly, if it were me, I don't think I'd have traveled.
All right, thank you. And we have one more question to finish us off for tonight. This question comes from Rachel Aguilera. She is asking, was the warning attached to all of the liners leaving not only from New York, but also from England?
The warning by the German, well, I'm not aware that the warnings were given both ways. Not in the particular way it was given for that one anyway, but I think that it was known that particularly after that one, and perhaps even before, that Germany was liable to attack anything in that blue zone. I'm not aware of any specific warning such as that particular one, which was very specific, wasn't it? But I'm sure people were aware that they were liable to be attacked at any time in that sort of exclusion zone. So, it may not have been specific, but it was certainly generally accepted that sailing was a dangerous thing to do through that zone.
Okay.
One of the things I think that was a bit sad is that one of the reasons that she was perhaps going slowly through that zone was that the captain was aiming for the correct tide into Liverpool, and perhaps he'd slowed up as much to meet the time schedule to hit the right tide as he did for any other reason. Maybe if he had kept the speed up, she wouldn't have been caught.
Okay, wonderful. Well, that concludes the end of our question and answer session. Thank you so much, Jim, for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you to everyone for your questions. And I'm now going to turn it over to the ESU Executive Director, Karen Karpwich, to say a few words.
Thank you, everyone. I want to thank Jim, who's been with us a while now. I mean, he's been at our branches and has been part of our community now for quite a while. I'm looking forward to meeting you one of these days, Jim, in person. I hope you can come back to New York and maybe you could do a lecture at headquarters. That would be lovely. And I also want to thank Carl for giving us that wonderful introduction and also telling us about your branch, which is always very interesting to hear about the branches and what's going on. I also want to say again that these programs are totally curated by our branches. And I want to again thank the Happy Hour Committee. I think we're approaching our 3rd year with this program, born out of the pandemic, but something that I think will be around for a long time because so many of you enjoy it. I also wanted to mention the fact that we are a membership organization, and I encourage all of you who are not members to become members. And you can get information on that when you fill out the actual questionnaire that you'll be sent on today's program. I hope I will see all of you back here again on June the 8th. At 4 o'clock, when we'll be talking about the eccentric billionaire, John MacArthur. So that sounds like really interesting and a lot of fun. So why don't you join us then on June the 8th as we kind of wind down this season for the summer, but I think it should be an enjoyable event. And thank you again and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Karen.